Alright, a bonus video I wanted to get in this week had to do with stuffing and making stuffing from scratch. This I typically don't have a straight recipe for, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it, take note of how much of everything that I use, and then derive a recipe from that for the comment section or the description. So to start, you need at least a loaf of bread. You're going to need eggs, celery, onions, and butter. So I have already cut up, diced up 2 onions and 5 stalks of celery. The individual stalks split down the middle. Those will be cooked down on the stove, and then we'll need to dice our bread. So what I do with the bread is I'll just go get a loaf of bread from the store. You can actually save the heels from your bread if you don't like eating the heels. Throughout the year, just keep them in a old bread bag and then keep them in the freezer. And then when Thanksgiving comes along, you can use those for your stuffing. What I'll do though is I'll just go get a new loaf of bread. What we want to do with the bread is you want to cut it 3 times each direction. So usually what I'll do is I'll put my hand like this with the knife between. This helps me anchor both sides as I'm doing the initial cuts. You'll notice I'm not using a chef knife. I'm using a knife that's scalloped. You want to use a knife that lets you essentially saw through the bread. This will give you cleaner edges. If I was using the chef knife, what it would be doing is it would be smashing through the bread. Bread's typically not tough enough or sturdy enough to use a chef knife to get clean cuts. So then when I do this sideways one, I don't use my finger to anchor the other side. I'm trying to anchor the 2 sides of the bread together, keep them in place, so at the part that I'm cutting off, what it's being cut off from is held in place, so it's easier to get it done. So you will do this enough times, add it to your collection of bread, and this will be the bread basis for the stuffing. And at this point you can let it sit and work on the onions and the celery. And we'll go to that point. For the onion and the celery, they typically melt down an entire stick of butter into a pan. Once it's all melted down, you just add it all in. You're going to simmer this on medium to low heat until the onions start becoming see-through. That's the point where you want to get them before you mix them in with the bread. There's a lot of vegetables, so the entire stick of butter helps us get enough coating and coverage on them to really begin. You're not cooking it down, but to start the cooking process for this. You mainly do this because you could add it straight to the stuffing, but I prefer to get these mostly on their way so that the end result there aren't chunky, hard pieces of onion or celery in the stuffing, but that they're softer and they match the final texture of the stuffing. So we'll let this go for a while and come back to it. Alright, try to get a good shot here. You can see, hopefully, that some of the onions are starting to be translucent. This is about the point we want to get to. So at this point, you turn off the heat and let it cool down a little bit. You'll be adding it to the stuffing mixture, which I typically mix by hand, so I don't want this to be right off the stove hot. I want it to cool down a little bit before I start trying to work it. Okay, at this point, we've let our butter, onions, and celery cool down a bit. I'm going to take that from the stove. We're just going to pour it in to our bread mixture. Well, not really mixture, just our diced bread at this point. At this point what I'll use is I'll typically use one of these to just kind of mix it in. It's when I get to the point of doing the eggs that I'll typically switch to using my hands. It's easier to work the egg in to the mixture that way than using a spatula. For the eggs, I find that it's not particularly necessary to beat the eggs or whip the egg, or whisk the eggs before. I will just crack them in. Sometimes I'll use a separate bowl just to make sure as I'm cracking them I don't get any eggshells. Then pour it in. I'm going to start with at least 4 eggs and then see what consistency we get with the stuffing. So you want to break these yolks up and then start to mix the egg in with your stuffing. Try not to like squeeze too much. You don't want to necessarily smush the pieces of bread you have. You just want to get it in there and coating. So it's like I'm starting to get a nice coat on the bread. It's going to take a couple more eggs. 2 more, which will bring me to 6. Pre-break these. Pour it in. So the butter and the egg is going to help, and the vegetables. So as the onion and celery continue to cook down, they'll release more moisture, and that'll help keep the stuffing moist so it doesn't dry out too much as you bake it. So this is a good consistency. All the bread is coated, but it's not necessarily soggy with egg, and that is the point at which we want to start adding in our poultry seasoning. So something to note, so poultry seasoning, if you don't have poultry seasoning, it is just a mixture of seasons and spices. So it's thyme, sage, marjoram, rosemary, black pepper, and nutmeg. If you don't, you can add them individually. You could always add them rather than this powdered form. If you wanted to add them in more of a kind of rough cut form, you can do that if you have it available. And then you'll have some salt that you want to add too. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sprinkle about a tablespoon poultry seasoning over. And then about a teaspoon of salt. How much seasoning you add is really going to depend on how strong you want it to be, and you can always salt after it's baked or rely on putting gravy on it as you eat as more of the seasoning to it. So this will just give it a good basic seasoning. Just looking at how much of this we have, it looks like it's going to fit in an 8x8 Pyrex pan. We just get it all in. It's pretty close. Now, it's alright if it's sticking up a little bit. What I typically will do for this stuffing is kind of push it into the corners, get it to fill in, and compress it a little bit. It gives a little bit more density to the stuffing when it's finally cooked. And you don't want it to be too loose. The egg is going to bind a lot of this together. So that is a good consistency there. I'm going to just stick in the oven at 350. I usually go for about 30 to 45 minutes and then check on it. Now, one thing I will also do is I will typically start it with some tin foil or aluminum foil just to help keep the initial moisture in the stuffing, and then near the end I'll pull it off and let the top kind of crust over and brown. And there we have it. So mine took a little bit longer, extra 10 minutes, so it ended up being 30 minutes covered and 25 minutes uncovered in the oven at 350. So one thing to note is that with this stuffing, it is, because the binder is egg-based, you do want to get it to an internal temperature of about 160. So if you have a kitchen thermometer, you can always test that and just open the oven, stick it in, see where it's at. If it's not quite there yet, but your top's getting a little crispy already, then you can recover it with the foil and let it go a little longer. Once it's done, you can either cut it like you would some sort of cake, or you can use a serving spoon to scoop out servings of stuffing.